Guard Commandant Admiral Linda Fagan. Welcome, Admiral Fagan. It's a pleasure to see you again, and I look forward. Those damn mics. I thank you for your testimony today as we discuss the Coast Guard's fiscal year 2024 budget request. Whether it is enabling the flow of commerce through our maritime transportation system, interdicting migrants on the open ocean, or combating illicit narcotic trafficking, our nation relies on the men and women of the Coast Guard. The demands on the Coast Guard have never been greater. The Arctic, Indo-Pacific, and maritime border have all presented challenges to the agency over the last year. I look forward to hearing about your plan to confront the growing economic and foreign military activity in the Arctic, particularly as the polar security cutter construction falls further behind schedule. Foreign interests, primarily China, are increasingly using illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing activities to steal resources and undermine the maritime rules-based order. Admiral Fagan, you have characterized IUU fishing as a top maritime security threat. With a mix of both law enforcement and military authorities, the Coast Guard is uniquely poised to address IUU fishing and prevent these illegal incursions into our exclusive economic zone and those of our allies. This is proven by the increased request by the Defense Department for Coast Guard expeditionary support. The Coast Guard's presence in the Indo-Pacific allows the United States to project power far from our shores and is a vital tool of national security and diplomacy. Moving closer to home, President Biden's failed policies have created a crisis at our borders. All the DHS components have been stretched thin, and the Coast Guard is no exception. The Coast Guard is interdicting near record numbers of migrants in the Caribbean transit zone, and over the past years, its vessels have been in capacity. Just in the past few weeks, Coast Guard Cutter Campbell apprehended and repatriated nearly 500 migrants who were traveling in overcrowded and unseaworthy vessels. This mission is difficult and dangerous for our Coast Guard men and women, and I thank them for their service, especially when you consider the Coast Guard Cutter Campbell was launched back in 1986. Admiral Fagan, I want to hear how this budget supports addressing the crisis at our border and how you look to grow capacity to ensure that our maritime border is secure. Unfortunately, the Coast Guard continues to struggle with major acquisition programs. As I mentioned already, the Polar Security Cutter, which has been originally set to be delivered in 2025, hasn't even begun construction. The 11th National Security Cutter is significantly behind schedule, and the newly awarded Waterways Commerce Cutter program is marred in legal challenges. We need to work together to ensure that the Coast Guard appropriately manages acquisition programs and delivers the assets required to protect our shores. Admiral, I look forward to working with you as we develop this year's appropriations bill. And now I turn to our before I turn to you for your statement, I would like to recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Cuellar, for his opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much, and members, it's always a pleasure being here with you. Again, Chairman, thank you so much for your leadership, and good morning, Admiral Fagan. It's nice to see you again. The Coast Guard plays a very critical role in many facets of our lives, from saving those that are in peril to securing our borders and ensuring our national security. The Coast Guard fiscal year 2024 budget request of $12.1 billion makes key investments in personnel, vessels, aircraft, and other programs that will assist in its search and rescue missions, along with its critical activities in our maritime borders, including the interdiction of drugs and addressing the increasing flow of migrants. To add to its growing set of responsibilities, the Coast Guard now is playing a critical role in the Indo-Pacific and the Arctic region. We know what China's doing in both of those areas. As you know, China now continues to call itself a near Arctic nation, even procuring at least 2 icebreakers, despite being thousands of miles away from the Arctic itself. China also works with Russia, a country that has at least 40 icebreakers, and some of them are armed to increase its presence in the Arctic. We certainly are interested about the work that y'all doing in the Indo-Pacific part of the strategic plan over there, and of course, what you're doing to counter the threats posed by China, and making sure that we have the resources to address that. I also certainly, being from the border, I'm certainly very interested in the work that y'all do with the flow of drugs and how that's that's coming into our maritime borders. And certainly, of course, the recruiting challenges that you are looking at. According to a recent GAO study, many cite a lack of access to childcare, education, as a reason to avoid services, and additionally, the mission demands on outpaced staffing levels, so we certainly want to work with you. As you know, later on today, we have Commissioner Troy Miller, and I know the committee has talked about what we've done for CBP, and I would ask you to spend time with them and the Department of Defense as to some of the ideas so we don't reinvent the wheel together. Finally, interested in your strategic plan, performance measures to make sure that we measure federal dollars, how they're being used, and in particular, want to talk to you about how we can jam those two ports, and I mean this in a nice way, the Mexican ports, where the legal precursors, and that's what makes it hard, that information sharing is important, are coming into those two ports from China and, of course, ending up here. So we look forward to working with you, and again, with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, the distinguished Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, sir.
Admiral Fagan, without objection, your full written testimony will be entered into the record. With that in mind, we ask that you please summarize your opening statement in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Joyce, Ranking Member Cuellar, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and thank you for entering my written testimony into the record. On behalf of the entire service, thank you for your continued support of the nation's Coast Guard. With the funding provided in the 2023 appropriation, we are continuing our largest fleet recapitalization in decades, building vital shore infrastructure and supporting our workforce and their families. The world is changing, and that pace of change is accelerating. Our commitments to protect, defend, and save grow every day, and demand for the service around the globe has never been higher. In these challenges, there's opportunity, and we must invest in 2024 and beyond to generate sustained readiness, resilience, and capability to build the Coast Guard of the future. The Coast Guard workforce is my highest priority. But like other branches of the armed forces, the Coast Guard is experiencing a workforce shortage. We are struggling to recruit the people we need to hire into our ranks every year. Our recruiting shortfall threatens our readiness and ability to serve the American people. We must invest not just in workforce recruiting capacity, but in support initiatives to meet mission. Healthcare, childcare, and housing are important. We're a global Coast Guard, and as we continue to invest in the Homeland, we counter strategic competition around the world. And the Coast Guard operates the nation's surface presence in the Arctic and Antarctica. Our fleet of only 2 polar icebreakers does not deliver the high-latitude presence we require as an Arctic nation. The FY 2024 budget request funding to grow the Coast Guard's icebreaker capacity to enable a shift from episodic presence to year-round presence in the high latitudes. Every Coast Guard mission begins and ends at a shore facility. To generate readiness, retain our workforce, and support our families, we must maintain and modernize our buildings, piers, housing, and other infrastructure. The Coast Guard requires stable, predictable shore infrastructure funding to ensure facilities are ready when new assets arrive, and personnel have the space they need to support the recapitalized fleet. Consistent funding is vital to us to recapitalize our many antiquated stations, sectors, training centers, air stations, and housing, some of which were built in the late 1800s. The FY 2024 budget includes funding to build out Base Charleston and to complete construction of future Cutter home ports in Washington and Alaska. My vision of the $20 billion Coast Guard of 2033 includes $400 to $500 million a year to accomplish this infrastructure work. I'm certain you will not find a better return on investment for the American people than the United States Coast Guard. I thank you for your continued support to ensure that the nation's Coast Guard, like every U.S. Armed Force, has the resources necessary to safeguard the nation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. Thank you for your enduring support. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Recognized for questions, and I'll start with myself. President Biden's failed immigration policies have created a crisis on our border. The maritime border is no exception. Over the last year, Near record numbers of migrants have attempted to cross the Caribbean transit zone. At times, Coast Guard assets were at capacity for holding migrants. Admiral, how does the budget support the increased number of migrants interdicted along maritime routes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Coast Guard is integral to the life-saving work that is encountering migrants at sea. We've been actively involved in the current maritime migration routes. The budget support for new assets, the offshore patrol cutter, are critical to the Coast Guard's ability to meet that challenge of maritime migration. Assets that we're using right now, some of them are, you mentioned the Campbell, built in 1986. So as those unit types age, unplanned maintenance, our ability to be on vector reliably is sometimes challenged. And so fielding the new cutters, offshore patrol cutter that'll replace those medium endurance cutters, is critical, and appreciate the budget support that we do have for offshore patrol cutter.
When you were developing this budget, did the Coast Guard assume there were a particular number of migrants you're going to be dealing with in FY24?
The FY24 budget, in all of our budgets, reflect realities around our work at sea, whether it is countering maritime migration, our work in the counter-narcotics realm, particularly in both the Eastern Pacific and the Caribbean. I've recently signed out a fleet mix analysis that looks at what is the fleet the Coast Guard needs to actively counter maritime threats, and that fleet mix is informed and supported by the 2024 budget.
It's my understanding Coast Guard assets has been at capacity for interdicting and holding migrants. What is the agency's plan for the number of migrants continue to increase? And put another way, what missions suffer when faced with this increased maritime program?
We have moved assets into the Florida Straits because of increases in migration numbers that started last fall. It peaked into the new year, and then we've experienced a decrease in numbers over the recent weeks and months. To ensure that we've got adequate holding capacity, that means a Coast Guard cutter with a flight deck on vector, and we have moved to ensure that we have that. The Homeland Security Task Force Southeast, which is led by a Coast Guard officer, then brings an integrated approach should the Coast Guard assets and other assets on scene be overwhelmed by numbers. We move to activate plans to ensure that people are able to be safely held, that we don't have a significant loss of life. And then for us, key is the ability to repatriate once we've encountered a migrant at sea.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Cuellar.
Mr. Chairman, thank you again so much. I want to talk about drug smuggling routes and threats. As you know, from one of your reports, if you look at cocaine, marijuana, and other things that come into the United States, they're coming in from Central America, so you got the routes. I would appreciate if y'all, and I know this is a little difficult because the opioids or the precursors coming in from China into those two Pacific coasts, Mexican coasts, as you know, I believe when you look at your drug seizures, you have zero for the last couple of years, you have zero for fentanyl, which means that they're probably either by coming in by plane, according to CBP, and then you got the precursors are coming in through those two ports in Mexico, and then probably mail. So we can see that there's no fentanyl, which means that there's certain routes that we're looking at. So therefore, focusing on the Pacific side, especially those two ports in Mexico, they come in, and it makes it hard because they're illegal, as you know, but there's got to be information sharing with the Mexicans. I hope that, I think you're hopefully meeting with them, you met with them over here. That's going to be key, because if we're looking for fentanyl in areas coming in from South America, you're going to find cocaine and other things. So appreciate if you can talk about what can we do, and I keep using the word jamming, because if they're coming into a particular area of Mexico, we got to work there, because once they go into the border, they got ports of entry, they can, passengers, cars, trucks, trains, and it makes it a lot harder.
Thank you. We obviously are actively engaged in interdicting narcotics at sea. The most effective way is to interdict at sea while narcotics are still in bulk form. And we have not encountered fentanyl. It is still primarily cocaine, some marijuana, and occasionally some methamphetamines. I did meet with the Mexicans last week, along with a number of other senior officials, CBP and DHS, to talk about the fentanyl problem set and what additional actions might help with the problem as you've identified. Encountering, before those substances leave the port, whether they're still in bulk form, is the most effective strategy. We talked about information sharing. Also talked with my Mexican counterpart, the head of the Mexican Navy, around how they are implementing their captain of the port authorities, very similar to the captain of the port authorities that the United States Coast Guard executes in the U.S. And I'm traveling to Mexico next week to continue that conversation. We'll meet with my counterpart in the port of Manzanillo, and this just as a network is moving these illicit narcotics, fentanyl. It will take a network of will to counter those activities, and we are engaged in those conversations. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, we, members, this makes it hard, because, it's legal precursors coming in, and so that information sharing is going to be important, because we don't find the same type of routes like you have here. It's just very, very different. But anyway, appreciate it. Yield back the balance of my time to, where's Mr. Case? I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cuellar. The chair now recognizes Mr. Newhouse for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman Joyce.
Every time I yield my time, he's going
My assistant is getting the microphone.
Where's the staff? Where's that?
There you go. There we go. Does that work? No? Well, good thing we have a small room here. But, Admiral Fagan, pleasure to have you here. Appreciate all the work that you and the men and women under you are doing for our country. And I also appreciate our Washington State connection. So, so as you pointed out in your testimony in the written part, some of the software and IT solutions that you have are vital tools for your mission for the military. And certainly the Coast Guard, I believe, is wise to look for ways to invest in tech modernization, particularly to support the maritime domain awareness activities and respond to national security threats, to cover everything that you've been talking about so far, the illegal fishing, the human and terrorism, the human and drug trafficking, particularly in the Caribbean, but also in the Pacific Northwest, which we're seeing quite a bit of it there as well. So just wanted to ask you a little bit about that effort. What are the goals of the new maritime domain awareness system? I know you've successfully utilized data integration before to combine data from various sources across the service to create a common operating picture. Does the Coast Guard have a strategy to identify and procure cost-effective commercial solutions that could be used just as effectively for maritime awareness?
Yeah, thank you. We've embarked on a number of initiatives. One with regard to data. We've stood up an office of data governance and analytics. Data is a competitive advantage, and so ensuring we've got the right framework around the data we already have and continue to create so that we can analyze it for decision space, use it for predictive analytics across mission sets, whether it's counter-narcotics, IUU fishing, and we are embarked on that. With regard to unmanned systems and technology, recently published the Coast Guard's unmanned systems strategy so that we can continue to field unmanned technology into the suite of capabilities that we operate. We're working with CBP to jointly operate an MQ-9 and with a joint program office, Scan Eagle, which I'm sure the committee's familiar with Scan Eagle and its role with our national security cutters, key enabler to increase effectiveness in our mission operations. Contracts with Sail Drone to improve maritime domain awareness. And so we are engaged and embarked on incorporating unmanned technology into the suite of capabilities that we're fielding. As I said, we've got some now, and we will continue to look for that opportunity in the future.
I appreciate that. Could you mentioned some of the challenges you're facing with attracting the number of individuals to come to the Coast Guard, not the quality, not questioning the quality of the individuals, but just the number that you need. Could you talk a little bit about some of the creative things maybe you're looking at to try to crack that nut?
Yeah, so the recruiting challenge is here and now for the Coast Guard. It is not unique to the Coast Guard. We are competing for talent, as are the other services and industry. There's been a shrinking pool of individuals who have a propensity to serve and frankly who are qualified to serve. Appreciate the support to allow us to increase investments in recruiting capacity. We're opening recruiting offices. We've stood up JROTC programs. But we're also, as we gain support with advertising dollars, recruiting dollars, we're going to where the young people are. So this means things like Twitch. It's an online gaming site, and we are actively seeking young people going to where they are instead of a big national, billboard or ad campaign. But and so it is an all-hands-on-deck effort for us, and we're using multiple avenues to create awareness and highlight what the opportunity is that service in the U.S. Coast Guard presents.
Very good. Thank you very much. Again, thanks for being here. And
you.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Newhouse. Chair now recognizes Ms. Underwood.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Admiral Fagan, congratulations on your appointment as Commandant, and thanks for being with us today. I want to turn right to the spending cuts that Republicans in Congress are discussing and what they would mean for the work of the U.S. Coast Guard. Slashing federal spending this severely back to fiscal year 2022 enacted levels would have unspeakably harmful consequences for each of our communities and for national readiness. For DHS, this would mean a cut of $3.4 billion. DHS reports this means the Coast Guard would, quote, immediately cease the advancement of acquisitions, procurement, and construction, resulting in a reduction to operational readiness along the maritime borders. Further, these cuts would, and I'm quoting here, reduce the ability to detect, deter, prevent, and disrupt terrorist attacks and other criminal acts in the U.S. maritime domain, as well as our national defense strategy. There's no other way to say it. Republicans' proposed cuts would endanger our national security. Admiral Fagan, can you share more about the effects that these drastic cuts would have on our defense readiness and the Coast Guard's ability to protect against terrorist attacks?
If the Coast Guard were held to the FY22 enacted level, that would create an immediate $500 million shortfall in the budget. That is compounded by inflation, increased fuel costs, increased costs of spare parts, and what it takes to operate the organization. As we build our budgets, the priority goes to operating and maintaining the organization, ensuring that our workforce is paid and has the support they need, that we've got fuel and ability to create frontline operations. Being held to a 22 budget level would have an immediate impact on readiness and capacity, and would be particularly impactful to our acquisitions projects. You can't scale on an acquisition. There are step functions there that would create immediate impacts. We would prioritize providing services to the American public, but it would come at the expense, again, major acquisitions, infrastructure investments, and otherwise.
In the Great Lakes region, we have more than 100 ports that fuel the economic engine for our region and our country. Since the Coast Guard is responsible for maintaining the safety and vitality of our ports, can you share how such cuts would impact global competitiveness, shipping, and overall safety at our ports?
So we have a role, in our captain of the port role, we have a role in ensuring the maritime security and economic prosperity of the nation. $5.4 trillion of economic benefit flow through our ports and through our inland rivers. Again, cuts impact capacity. We will work to preserve frontline capacity to the greatest extent possible, but at some point, if we don't have funding support for fuel, and particularly where it becomes impactful is in maintenance, spare parts, the maintenance account to ensure that we can reliably field those aspects, any and all assets, whether there's small boats in the ports. It would impact the waterway commerce, cutter acquisition, which is critical to ensuring the resiliency of our inland waterways and systems, and it would touch all aspects of Coast Guard operations.
And which would have an economic impact.
It would have an economic impact.
Okay. Now, another one of the Coast Guard's missions is environmental compliance and restoration. This includes identifying and cleaning up contamination from hazardous substances and pollutants, as well as correcting environmental damage that poses an imminent danger to public health. In the Great Lakes, we know this work is critical. 30 million people rely on the Great Lakes as their primary water source, so ensuring that the water is clean and safe couldn't be more important for public health. Can you provide an update on the environmental compliance and restoration activities that the Coast Guard is focusing on, specifically in the Great Lakes, and how would your FY24 budget request help advance Great Lakes priorities?
Yeah, so I don't have specifics on Great Lakes, but I affirm that we are committed to our role in protecting the environment and environmental response, our role as a pollution response organization. We continue to make investments in the resources and the people and the expertise that are needed to ensure that you prevent pollution from occurring in the first place. Our role with regulated facilities, with the maritime industry and shipping to inspect and ensure that both the facilities and ships are operating in compliance with state, federal, international regulations in some cases to prevent impacts to the environment, and we continue to make those investments to fulfill our role as a environmental protection and maritime response organization.
Well, if you can get back to us about how your fiscal 24 proposal would support the Great Lakes in this area, and then how the proposed cuts would have an impact, that would be really helpful. I yield back. Thank you.
Chair appreciates the gentle lady's captivity with the Great Lakes. Well, very fond of it myself.
Thank you.
Mrs. Hinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Admiral. Thank you so much for coming before our committee today, and I look forward to this opportunity to speak with you. And I want to talk about an area that's very important for my district. We sit right along the upper Mississippi River. The city of Dubuque obviously hosts the Coast Guard cutter Wyaconda. A priority for me to ensure that the Mississippi River is protected and maintained also. So I think it's a stability issue for our regional economy and really for our global supply chain as well, which is why it's a priority for me. So I want to say thank you for the work that you do to make sure that the Coast Guard is supported there. And can you just describe to me how the requested funding would aid in making sure that that installation is still supported and that we can continue to prioritize critical infrastructure along the upper Mississippi and lower Mississippi River?
Yep. So thank you, and I appreciate the support of the committee for our waterway commerce cutter acquisition, the WCC. The 24 budget includes $98 million to begin constructing the first two of the waterway commerce cutters, and also includes money for long lead time material for an additional two. We are excited about the design there's two variants for those ships. They will be replacing cutters. If you've visited, these are very old cutters in need of updated new hulls, and we are excited to be on budget for that. The FY24 UPL includes $48 million to build out home ports in Sault Ste. Marie and Memphis, and we are working through prioritizing the investments that are needed to ensure that we meet and are able to ensure reliable, safe commerce flows on our inland rivers, Mississippi and others.
Right. Well, and especially as we have conversations about other parts of the world that are facing those challenges, it is absolutely a priority to make sure we can protect this region at home. So I'm glad to hear that you share that priority and look forward to working with you to make sure we can execute on that mission. Speaking of areas around the world, obviously the Coast Guard's mission in Indo-PACOM is critical, especially with what's happening with the Chinese Communist Party's aggression, making sure we're focused on securing our allies in the region and protecting maritime security. Can you describe a little bit the efforts that the Coast Guard maintains to stabilize Indo-PACOM region, but also what the current relationships are with our strategic partners in the region?
We are committed to the Indo-Pacific region. The capabilities, the expertise, the professionalism that the U.S. Coast Guard brings to difficult, particularly maritime problem set, is valued around the world and is eagerly sought around the world. And our allies and partners around the Pacific are actively seeking engagement with the United States Coast Guard. The 23 budget had $41 million to provide increased presence and engagement in the Indo-Pacific. We are fielding an Indo-Pacific support cutter. We've identified it as the Harriet Lane, and that cutter will arrive into Honolulu before the end of the year, and will work out of there for a couple years as we work through where the final home port will be. On the UPL, we have signaled $400 million, which would buy an additional 4 fast response cutters. That would increase our ability to create presence in the Pacific. The fast response cutters have been incredibly capable assets for us. We have them fielded in Guam and Honolulu now, and they're doing great work engaging the kinds of partnership and engagement that our allies value. And then mobile training teams, just bringing our expertise to nations where they are, whether it's how to do illegal fisheries boarding, small engine repair, small boat maintenance and operations, and we will continue to lean into that as well.
And if you could follow up with our office with some of the countries that you've been doing that work with, that would be helpful, because we are working, obviously, I had the opportunity to meet with the president of Taiwan just a few weeks ago, and I think continuing to show force of strength in that region is going to be critical to countering China's influence in the region. Obviously, we know they are continuing to spread propaganda, misinformation throughout that region. Are you actively countering those efforts as well? Obviously, you're talking about some of the on-the-ground training and tools that you're using. Are you doing anything to counter the misinformation and the propaganda?
Yeah, I mean, our value proposition is in that competitive space, short of conflict, and so where we've got expertise, skill, are a partner of choice, we are bringing that to the region, and welcome the opportunity to highlight. It's a double-digit number of countries that we've engaged in. I've spent time in Fiji meeting with 20 of our partners throughout the Pacific to talk about maritime security, maritime governance. Look forward to getting back to you with that.
Wonderful. Do you think that this budget request allows you the bandwidth necessary to complete those critical missions?
So the budget request is supportive of that. As I've indicated, our UPL signals opportunity for additional investment, particularly in fast response cutters, to allow us to become sort of less episodic and more persistent with regard to some of the threats in the region.
All right. Thank you, Admiral, and I will yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stinson. And Chair now recognizes Sheriff Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Cameron, great to see you again, and I'm really appreciative of all that the Coast Guard does, particularly around the state of Florida, all those interdictions. And knowing how important the water operations are, but the aviation side, I want to talk about that for a moment, because I'm hearing that the U.S. Coast Guard has stated that they plan to transition to all MH-60 helicopters in the fleet by acquiring used helicopters from the Navy. And I know there's been quite a bit of funding, I think, set aside for that transition. But here's what I wonder, if we're being a little penny wise and pound foolish, I'll say. For the airframes that you're going to acquire from the Navy, do we have an idea what the average time is on these airframes?
I don't have a number with regard to time. Obviously, we are committed to moving towards a single fleet of 60s, tail fold, blade fold, so that they will also be flight deck accessible. As we go on budget, and the 24 UPL asks for $113 million to outfit and assemble four 60s, and that will enable us to transition another air station in 26. I don't have the time phasing on that, but we'd be happy
Sure,
to get back to you on it.
So are we also going to have to make hangar changes for these MH-60s, particularly on the cutters?
So the criticality, so the national security cutters and the offshore patrol cutters with a tail fold, blade fold capability, the 60s will be able to be accessible to those two cutter classes.
Okay, so there won't be any need to modify the hangars on those cutters?
Not that I am aware of. The shore infrastructure pieces around aviation, for example, as we fielded the C-130Js, there were modifications to shoreside hangars that were needed to make
Well,
as that
that- yeah,
asset
that's
came
another
on
issue, too.
larger. But I'll confirm with
Issue.
the staff. I am not aware that we've got modifications, certainly with the new cutter classes.
Okay.
The 60s larger than some of the older legacy fleet would be able to accommodate the, 270s
Right,
and
and
otherwise.
that's why I wanted to ask about, the hangaring capability, both shore and fleet. The maintainers, what are we looking at as far, I understand that the MH-60 requires many more maintainers than some other options that might be out there. So my question is, can we get some information on just those issues? I would appreciate that. And the unmanned program, you talked about that a little bit earlier, and you mentioned the sail drone for the water, but what about airborne unmanned?
Yep, so be happy to provide you more details around what the phasing of moving to a single fleet of 60s is as it pertains to infrastructure, people, maintainers, and happy
Right.
to provide that.
Okay.
The unmanned systems strategy that we just published acknowledges that unmanned technology is here now. We as an organization need to look for where the opportunity is to continue to field that. Scan Eagle is the program of record, the system that we've got fielded on the national security cutters, a contractor-owned, contractor-operated, shipboard launched and retrieved, fixed-wing UAS, and we continue, we're getting great benefit from that, and we continue to explore other opportunities for unmanned systems in our Coast Guard operations.
We look forward to helping you with that. This is from right field or left field. Last year, NOAA proposed a rule that would require all boats longer than 35 feet to go 10 knots all up and down the coast, the Atlantic coast. And Commandant, I have to tell you, the economic impact of that is going to be huge, particularly on our commercial fisheries and sport fishing, if they can only go 10 knots. Now, because there's a safety issue there, the Coast Guard's, and this is in response to the right whale issue, which I've got legislation to save the right whale, but my concern is, and I'm hearing this from the bar pilots and others, that this 10 knots is really going to put ship safety in question, and you all are going to have to pick up the enforcement of that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Was the Coast Guard even included in this decision-making process, or did NOAA just do this on their own?
So I am aware of the NOAA legislation. We obviously have a role in advising on maritime safety. What level of advisement went on prior, I don't know. We can get back to you on that. The primary enforcement method for a 10-knot limitation is AIS, and we continue to work with NOAA. Not all, there's a disparity between AIS carriage requirements and then the speed restriction, and so we continue to be engaged in that conversation.
Okay, but, so you think they did confer with the Coast Guard before they made this decision?
I'll get back to you with certainty who and when, or if not, I don't have that information.
Okay, thank you, Commandant. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
That's a negative amount of time, Sheriff.
Sorry about that.
Mr. Cloud?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Admiral, for being here. Certainly want to thank you and all the people who work with you in what you do. I'm on the Texas coast, so we certainly appreciate the Coast Guard and have visited the bases in our district a number of times, and it's always good to get with them to see the work that they're doing firsthand. It's really great. Because of that, I could also speak to certainly the need to make sure that they're well acquisitioned as well, and that they have the parts they need. Last time I visited, I think there were some choppers that were down and they couldn't deploy, but they were working on it. So we want to make sure that they're well supplied. I wanted to ask you on a couple things that are particularly sensitive to the Texas coast, and one of them is the migrant population that the Coast Guard is encountering now. I think March 23 article highlighted the Coast Guard Sector San Diego witnessed a 700% increase in the number of migrant maritime crossings since 2017. Do you have the assets you need to deal with this situation? I know I've been a fan of the area stats that were being used and deployed, and would certainly advocate for those to continue to have their use along our southern border. Anyway, if you could speak to having what you need to deal with the situation and what kind of tax that's putting on your ability to do your other missions in the area.
Yeah, as you've identified, maritime migration flows are up across all of the vectors, including the vector into San Diego. The fast response cutters have been a key, significant capability for us, and so as we look at budget and support for the Coast Guard continuing to field the new assets and capabilities that we're stepping into now will be critical to ensuring that we've got the capability that we need to counter those migration flows. The RECOM and the other interagency effort down there, there's a great team of professionals. It's not just the Coast Guard. We're a
Right.
primary on-the-water
Yeah.
presence, but we continue to engage with our other law enforcement partners in that realm, and look to for opportunities for unmanned systems to increase maritime domain awareness, so that when a migrant attempt is made, we're able to put an asset on vector and ensure that we one, prevent the loss of life, and then two, have a positive
Yeah, and of course that's
interdiction.
drug trafficking as well that's coming in, and we've had drugs wash up on our shore, in our district a number of times. But it kind of connected and unconnected at the same time, the illegal fishing that goes on along the coast, a lot of it coming out of Mexico, some of it seemingly to be a cover for cartel operations even at times. Could you speak to what you need to be even more effective at what you're doing there?
Yeah, IUU fishing, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, is a global issue. And we experience it in the United States, certainly in the Gulf of Mexico. We published an IUU strategy a few years ago to help bring alignment and leadership to the problem set. In the specific to the Gulf Coast of the United States, again, the fast response cutters and our small boats are our primary capability that we work to counter that activity. And so, again, as we continue to field those new acquisitions, it just increases our effectiveness in those vectors as it pertains to IUU fishing, migration, counter narcotics, and so sort of staying the course with the major acquisitions in the programs that we're on record for will be critical to ensuring that we're able to meet those missions.
I noticed there wasn't a budget increase request for that, so I'm guessing you believe you have what you need to handle that mission, or?
Yeah, so all of the assets are multi-mission.
Sure,
So we
right.
don't, say this cutter just for this
For
mission.
fishing versus-
so-
yeah, I get
Right,
it, right.
but when you look at the fleet mix, we're working to field new state-of-the-art capacity. It will allow us to meet mission across those number of portfolios.
Yeah, I had one other line I wanted to ask you on. Russia and China recently conducted routine patrols in the Arctic, and obviously that's going to be a threat we have to continue to stay aware of. I know that there's a request for $125 million for a commercially available icebreaker that was taken out of, the Senate basically took it out of the last cycle, I guess because there were some concerns about retrofitting it once it was purchased, or is that figure, the $125 million, does that cover the whole, getting it where you need it to be, or is there cost beyond that after we purchase it? What's that figure detail?
So if appropriated, the $125 million would allow the purchase of a commercially available icebreaker. So an additional $25 million to help bring that to IOC. We are working.
So you really need $150 million
We're,
to
and
put it
both,
to use.
we're in the 24 present budget, the number is reflective of what it will need to acquire and get to in initial operating capacity, that particular vessel. We're working to monetize what the out year, what the life cycle cost is still something we're
Okay,
working
gotcha.
to definitize.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. And I also wanted to speak to get your take on the polar security cutters that are yet to be delivered in the time, I'm out of time.
There's a second round. We'll
I'll
get you
ask,
there.
yeah, I'll ask you more later.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, appreciate it. Welcome, Commandant.
1 o'clock.
The Coast Guard's been underfunded for years. You said your priorities promoting, diversifying, providing for your workforce what it needs to meet the demands of the modern Coast Guard. But without increased funding, it's clear you won't come close to achieving that goal. Can you highlight the aspects in the FY24 budget that talk about recruiting, sustained readiness, and of course, retention of your best people?
Thank you. We've got a number of line items in the 24 budget that will help across that fold. The funding support and recruiting is allowing us to field additional recruiters, open new recruiting offices, allows us to increase just advertising and engagement. We're fielding additional JROTC programs, all designed to address the recruiting challenge. The budget also supports investments in, pay, housing allowances to ensure that our personnel are able to find housing as they transfer around the country. Investments in our medical capacity and medical personnel to increase, access to mental health and behavioral health and other medical needs. And subsidies as well as investments in child, so improving access to childcare, whether it be subsidies or access to a Coast Guard-operated child development center. The 24 budget provides great support. And while we recruit an individual, we retain their families, and so ensuring we've got that support appropriate to and for our Coast Guard members is critical.
That's really important, the whole wraparound. If you don't take care of the family, the Guard's not going to be successful. No question about it. It's about everybody. Drug interdiction, international drug interdiction, you've done quite a bit of that, I read. That requires flexibility in your budget to move resources where you need to move them. What needs to be done? How can we help you be better off and be stronger on interdiction work, especially the fentanyl precursors shipped in from China to Mexican ports?
So with regard to the maritime interdictions, continuing to support the portfolio of acquisitions that the Coast Guard has embarked on are critical to ensuring we're able to meet that mission. It is a force package of ships, helicopters, pursuit boats that allow us to interdict illegal narcotics at sea. The fentanyl challenges, so we're not encountering fentanyl to a large extent at sea, and so that becomes a partner in capacity conversation. As I said, I'm engaged with my Mexican counterparts within the law enforcement agencies within DHS are working to identify ways to better counter the fentanyl threat, particularly as the chemicals move through ports other than the United States.
Talk a little bit about how you're exploring the use of long-endurance, autonomous, uncrewed surface vehicles to augment your crewed platforms and interdiction efforts.
So the unmanned system strategy that we've just published is designed to help us move forward strategically around what unmanned systems can provide key enabling information and capacity to us as an organization, and whether it's increased maritime domain awareness or just opportunities so that when we put a person on a ship in an aircraft, that you know exactly where you're going and you're going to be on time, on target, and unmanned technology has a role there. And we're working to increase how we internalize that into our operating capacity.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you, Commandant.
Recognizing myself on a second round of questions, I want to follow up on something my colleague, Ms. Sunderwood, had brought up. That is your budget request, including the $55 million for Great Lakes icebreaker. The Mackinac and your fleet of multi-purpose 140-foot icebreaking tugs are essential for keeping commerce moving. These vessels are approximately 40 years old. Modern vessels could be more capable and have improved crew accommodations. If Congress funds the $55 million request for Great Lakes icebreaker, would a service be available to spend the funds in FY24?
Thank you. We are excited about the opportunity for a Great Lakes icebreaker. We've completed pre-acquisition work, and the $55 million would support an ability to go out with a request for proposals for an icebreaker that is as capable as the Mackinac. I'm excited about what that opportunity is for the organization. We're working through design requirements and technical requirements, but we have made progress on the Great Lakes icebreaker in the last year.
Are you going to be able to spend the money in FY24?
We will be able to spend the money in FY24, and we'll work towards a request for proposals.
I understand the 140-foot tugs, two of which are home ported in Ohio, recently completed a service life extension. By how long did that extend their service life, and what is the ultimate replacement plan?
I don't have the exact number. Typically, a service life extension will be 10 to 15 plus years. The waterways commerce cutter then becomes, key new assets as we field them along our internal waterways to ensure that we're able to reliably provide for the safety, security of the inland river system.
If Congress provides funds for a Great Lakes icebreaker, how would the vessel complement the icebreaking assets that already exist in the Great Lakes?
So we operate a system of icebreakers in the Great Lakes, the Mackinac being the largest of that system, and there are other smaller inland fleet of vessels. The Great Lakes icebreaker will then become an additional capacity that will help ensure year-round access on the Great Lakes. How it then contributes to the fleet mix and what the smaller ice-breaking capacity is and needs are as part of the work that's ongoing in the organization.
Could it replace some of the work done by the 140s?
We're working through all the analysis. I'm happy to come back to you with more detail on how Mackinac, Great Lakes icebreaker, 140s, and kind of what the way ahead looks like with regard to those investments.
Look forward to that. Recognize Mr. Cuellar for the second round.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I want to go back to your visit with the Mexicans and ask you to continue focusing on a couple things. I want to bring up a couple things. One, the Mexicans for the first time are spending almost $900 million on technology for their land ports and for their seaports. And they are pretty much using the same American companies that CBP uses on the U.S. side. The Mexican Navy awarded about $330 million, and the Mexican Army another 613. So I say this because a lot of the ports are now going to have the same type of technology, that we have. So I would ask you to work with them. And I know that when it comes to fentanyl, we've been talking about fentanyl, it's a little harder, the pill pressers and what's legal. And the Mexicans are looking at certain chemical watch lists. They're going from 14 to 72. So make sure you focus on that. But I would ask you to look at those ports and push them to try to get that technology and make sure that technology can be shared with us, the information. Second thing is, let me go back to fentanyl again. Y'all have had for the last few years zero interdiction on fentanyl. And again, we already talked about it. But again, I would ask you to look at those two ports and put an emphasis on those two ports because they come in, they're manipulated, and then they go up through, not in between ports, but at the ports of entry. And again, it's hard because even the technology that we have now to try to find something this size compared to a marijuana, it's very different. So I would ask you to work with them on that information sharing, especially when you look at the flows and where they're going in. Third thing, I would ask you to think ahead. Mexico's doing their Isthmus Corridor, and they're moving fast. It's incredible what they're doing. And I would ask you to look at this because the Chinese already on the Gulf of Mexico, they're looking at investments there, and on the Pacific side. So I would ask you to look at that because, that's, members, that's a coast, they're going from one to the other one. It's not a Panama Canal, but it's rail and it's also highways. And they're moving very fast on it. I call it the new Mexican Panama, not canal, but route also. And again, interesting, the Chinese are at the very beginning and at the very end, depending what side you're looking at. So I would ask you to look at that also. Finally, talking about the Chinese, when you look at where the Chinese are at, I know we look at the Indo-Pacific, we look at other places, they're in our own backyard, members, and I would be happy to share with you, but they're doing a lot of things. And if you look at those two ports of entry seaports, Chinese have investments. In fact, there are cranes and all that, Chinese. So you can understand why the legal precursors are coming out easily itself. But I would ask you to look at it. I know the land ports are a little different from what, but I would ask you and ask them questions about the Chinese presence there because they can't talk about it here, but I would say they're very, very close to a lot of things that we're doing here on the U.S. side. So I would ask you to look at the Isthmus, number one, the new technology that they're buying, it's American companies that Marina is using, and the Chinese involvement there, because they're, name it, and they're there. There's industrial parks, they're there. And seaports are definitely in those two Pacific. So again, it's more not of a question, more of a statement, but I would ask you when you meet with the Mexicans, focus on that if you don't mind, and then get back to us. I would appreciate it. To the committee.
I will, and as I said, I will be in the Port of Manzanilla on Tuesday, meeting with my Mexican counterparts, and look forward to sharing those conversations when I return.
Thank you. Thank you, Admiral.
Thank you on behalf of all of us for doing that. Ms. Henson?
Thank you. Just a couple of questions, and I'd actually like to follow up on something Mr. Cuellar pointed out about kind of the Chinese strategy around the world. And obviously, Indo-PACOM is the most visible, I think, area where we've seen recent aggression. But can you just comment briefly about, have you seen any other places in the world where they're showing that aggression directly, places that we might need to be aware of? And yeah, if you could just elaborate on that to start, that would be great.
So certainly the Chinese are very, very active around the Indo-Pacific, but they are active in South and Central America, Africa, looking for opportunities to invest and gain access. With regard to, maritime operations, obviously, as we send ships into the Western Pacific, we do that in conjunction with the U.S. Navy and continue to ensure that our ships are, have the correct readiness level should we encounter unfriendly behavior on the part of the Chinese Coast Guard.
What keeps you up at night about that challenge?
The world continues to change at a quickening pace, and as we operate in maritime areas that are competitive and challenging, ensuring that my workforce has the readiness level that they need to meet whatever the challenges they might find in the mission that we've asked them to do.
Right, and you mentioned that obviously in your opening statement that you are having challenges with readiness because of recruitment. Can you elaborate a little bit on what those challenges have been, and if there are any barriers, are those things that this committee can be helpful with, or other ways we may look at assistance there?
Yeah, so I appreciate the support, the funding support that we've got to build increased recruiting capacity. The recruiting is a highly individualized effort. It's one-on-one, human being to human being. It takes a fair amount of interaction. Also appreciate the support for some of the technology systems that help make it easier once we have found the person who's interested in coming to us, easier to onboard them. And I'm committed to making sure we've got the right resourcing in place to recruit people, and then just telling our story. There are so many Americans that have no idea what the U.S. Coast Guard is, what we do, and then the opportunity and the value proposition that we offer as an employer. And so I appreciate the support, and we'll continue to get out there and tell our story.
Did you lose any of your workforce due to the COVID vaccine challenges? I know that obviously that was something we heard a lot about, that some people may have chosen to leave as a result of that or retire. Is anyone offering to come back? I guess I'd just be curious what that did to your...
We had a number of individuals who we did remove from service for failure to be vaccinated. We have contacted 100% of those individuals, both active duty members and cadets, and some are choosing to come back. In fact, we had our first one come back onto the active duty roles just this past Friday.
Okay. Can you get me some numbers on what that looks like in terms of how many actually you had to ask to leave, and then how many have been contacted, what that looks like? Just
so it was 275 that were asked to leave. We've contacted 100% of them, and the first one has come back on. We're using the same process to re-onboard people, for who have left for other reasons, and I don't know what the total. It's too early to tell how many will actually come back, but 100% have been contacted.
Okay. Thank you, Admiral.
Thank you, Mrs. Hinson. Mr. Trones recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question. Your unfunded priority list includes a need for a facility in Baltimore. Can you discuss the importance of this facility and your plans on any funding for future appropriations? This would be a ship handling facility capable of working on maintenance, extending service life of vehicles in the port of Baltimore.
So we operate the Coast Guard Yard in Baltimore. This investment would be directed at our organic yard capacity. That capacity is critical to us maintaining our major cutter fleet. The UPL asked for $60 million. It will include shore preparations, dredging, facility upgrades that would enable us to integrate a larger floating dry dock, so that as it would be large enough to allow us to service the offshore patrol cutters when they come online. So this is a future investment to ensure that we are able to maintain the fleet that we are acquiring now.
Good. I appreciate that. We'd be happy to support that as you move forward and you put that at the top of your list. Thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. Mr. Cloud.
Thank you. So my questions that I had have been answered, but I did want to continue kind of the dialogue about China, because one of my major concerns is just our shipbuilding capacity here in the United States and our ability to keep pace, and obviously that would affect a lot of the Coast Guard's acquisition, but also just maybe speaking to that aspect of it, but also anything else that you are concerned with in our ability to keep pace with what you see China doing.
Yeah, so continuing to move forward with the portfolio of major asset investments and infrastructure investments are critical to fielding a capable, ready Coast Guard. So, as it includes Polar Security Cutter, the Waterway Commerce Cutter, the Offshore Patrol Cutter, potential additional investments in fast response cutters. As I said, the UPL signals $400 million for an additional 4, and that would create additional presence, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, to allow us to partner, engage with ally and partner nations with, our value proposition and the expertise and governance that the United States Coast Guard brings to maritime governance challenges. And that also extends to the infrastructure investments so that we can have a safe place to tie those ships up and our people have buildings and offices that they can operate from safely.
How about, how would you say we compare is in regards to acquiring the speed and ease, how quickly we can?
Yeah. So we acquire
generality
major
of
assets consistent with federal acquisition law. It is
Sure.
not a fast process. We're committed to following the process and way forward, working through understanding requirements so that you can get to design and then begin to build. It takes time, but using that process is important so that you actually get the ship capability that you need, not
Right.
something that does not meet your requirements.
Sure. Part of that obviously is the ability to staff our acquisitions, and so to the point of recruiting, I was curious about that as well. And for those coming back, what incentive are there for them to come back? Is their rank restored, their pay restored? How does that work?
Yeah, so we have had a process in place to bring people back who have left the service for whatever reason. We are using that same process. And, I can certainly get you all the specifics on length of time, how we step back through it, but they come back in to position, not necessarily position, but pay grade and skill set that they left, and then we work to assign them and get them employed by the organization.
And what efforts are being made? Because most who leave and come back, I don't think were asked to leave in the first place. And so what is there in place to make sure that they understand that there's no reprisal or any sort of action to be taken against them?
Yeah, as I said,
having been
we've
asked to leave in the
contacted
first place?
100% of them and said we welcome you back. There's we've already gone through, as required by law, there is no evidence in anyone's records with regard to vaccination, non-vaccinated. And so you truly we're welcoming back people who are interested in coming back.
Thank you. And I do appreciate you reaching out to each of them. Thank you.
Ms. Rutherford? Sheriff Rutherford. Technically, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on the China involvement and threat as well. The IRI, the International Republican Institute did a great report on malign Chinese influence and the corrosion of democracy, and one of the countries that they looked at was Ecuador and the Galapagos Islands specifically. Can you talk a little bit about what the Coast Guard is doing down there to stop the IUU fishing that Ecuador is suffering right now?
So we have a global leadership role in IUU fishing. It truly is a worldwide problem. Recently, maybe 18 months ago, Ecuador was experiencing a Chinese squid fleet incursion into their exclusive economic zone off of the Galapagos, and Ecuador asked for assistance. What the U.S. Coast Guard was able to do was take one of the large cutters that was conducting counter-narcotics work and shift their attention towards the Chinese squid fleet. We moved the cutter over. The squid fleet moved off, they 200 miles away from where they were, and so it certainly speaks to the criticality of presence.
Right.
Being visible there with a ship changed the pattern of behavior of the Chinese fishing fleet in that case. And it speaks to the network and coalition that help counter some of these difficult maritime challenges. We also, in the IUU fishing realm, engage in a lot of bilateral agreements and shipwrighter agreements that bring a nation's expertise and authority in fisheries enforcement and onto one of our vessels, and allows us to conduct joint boardings in a way that's it's helpful in the mission set.
Good. Yeah, that was some great work down there. Let me ask on the we were talking earlier about the number of migrants who how that number is up, the interdictions, particularly around Florida. I'm hearing that there's some countries that are resistant to repatriation, some outright blocking it, others just making it difficult as they can. I would ask, do we have some information on countries that are specifically rejecting repatriation?
When we interdict a migrant at sea, we process them, provide, food and sort of shelter, and then we repatriate them to the country of origin. The primary migrant flows are Haiti and Cuba, and we are able to directly repatriate to both those countries.
Okay. They're not giving us a hard time getting those folks back?
There are a number of pieces. Again, I'll have the staff give you all of the pieces that it takes to process and then repatriate, but we are continuing to repatriate to both of those countries.
Okay. So are you aware of any countries that are refusing repatriation?
I am not, but I will have the staff affirm whether
Yeah,
that's
if you
true
could
or
let me
not.
know about that. Thank you. I do appreciate that. And, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back and make up for the first round.
You just about caught up. Dr. Harris?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Admiral, for being here today. I represent the 1st Congressional District of Maryland, bounded by the ocean on one side and the bay on the other side in the most part. And I've been very concerned about the industrialization of the offshore mid-Atlantic. And that's basically what these wind farms are going to be. They're just industrialization of a place that's never been industrialized before, and a place over which the Coast Guard has some jurisdiction and some interest. Of interest to me, Monday, the Bloomberg published a story, Pentagon sounds alarm over Biden plan for offshore wind sites. But the line that I'm going to refer to is on page 2 of the article, the Defense Department's concerns, which come on top of other conflicts identified by the U.S. Coast Guard. So does Bloomberg have it right? Are there other conflicts with regards to offshore wind in the mid-Atlantic that have been identified by the U.S. Coast Guard?
Our role in the wind farm conversation is around ensuring safety of navigation and, advising the process to ensure that fishing vessels, other waterway users are not negatively impacted by wind farm installations. The Atlantic Coast Route Study is part of that. We've had an active role. I'll have the team look at what that might be referring to. There's obviously, ensuring the safety of movement of maritime traffic, and advising on that is the role the Coast Guard plays.
So in April 2013, the Coast Guard sent a letter to BOEM advising that their then current proposed wind energy area location posed, quote, unacceptable increases in risk to navigation safety. And BOEM went ahead anyway. So, and that's in the first phase. Now the administration wants a second phase further offshore. The Defense Department has concerns. I don't know if the Coast Guard still has concerns. But I'm going to ask you a question. Has the Coast Guard analyzed the effect on search and rescue missions that these windmills might pose if they off the coast, because I have a lot of both private and commercial vessels who traffic in that area. God forbid something happens, conditions aren't great. Has the Coast Guard studied the effect on search and rescue of these windmills?
Impact on search and rescue is part of the consideration that we've looked at. I'd be happy to have the team come over and sort of walk you through where exactly we are at this point in time with regard to the advice we've been providing to BOEM across, again, ensuring safety of navigation, safety of life as the wind farms proceed.
Sure, and I would imagine since some of the interferences with radar, I would imagine, the newest proposed Vestas 15 megawatt windmill, 919 feet tall, much taller than ones that have been looked at in the past. I would imagine they could have differential effects on radar. I'm sure they haven't been studied because this is a relatively new windmill and it's what's going to happen in the future. I do have concern that you only advise BOEM on this because you all are the experts in maritime navigational safety, not BOEM. BOEM, it appears, has an agenda here. And I worry about it because their agenda, I think, conflicts with maritime safety. And I think that was in a letter, again, the April 2013 letter advising BOEM. BOEM completely disregarded it, and here we are. We're back again because now that BOEM wants to re-expand, wants to lease new areas, and I'm afraid they're going to take the same attitude with that. Anyway, if you get back to me on that, I appreciate that. The second thing I have is an issue of navigational buoys. Again, these are mostly in the bay. So what's happened is we have a couple of federal channels, Slaughter Creek, Tar Bay Gap, where the navigational buoys were removed by the Coast Guard because, the channel silted in. Coast Guard said, this not there's no channel here anymore. It's too shallow a depth. We're taking the markers out. So I have two questions. One is, when that happens, do you communicate the importance of that to the Army Corps so that they take that into account when they do their dredge plans? And the second one is, could you allow and expedite private aids to navigation being placed in those channels? Because without markers, as you can imagine, you're left on local knowledge, which sometimes isn't that much. And other entities have wanted to place markers and run up to into the Coast Guard, I'll say bureaucracy, or maybe policy, of not being allowed to put a private aid to navigation there. So is this something that we can work with together to make sure that, look, something is in that channel? And I get it if it's not deep enough to be a Coast Guard marked channel, but our watermen and our private boaters do need some markers.
No, look forward to working with you on that, and we'll take back that specific issue to the team and see where we are with regard to private aids to navigation.
Thank you very much, Admiral. Thank you. I yield back.
Since we've had a second round of questions, if you had any more, you feel free to take this opportunity.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that, but I think, again, we'll work with the Admiral on the offshore wind issues, safety issues. It's just very concerning to me as my watermen, my commercial fishermen, my private fleet, charter boat captains, et cetera, express a lot of concern about shortcuts being taken over at BOEM that don't take into consideration the input of interested parties and experts, not only just interested parties. And again, I can't emphasize this. There's nobody at BOEM who knows navigational safety as well as the Coast Guard does.
Certainly.
And for them to disregard that letter back in 2013, I think is highly problematic, highly problematic. But no, I appreciate the offer. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. There may be additional questions from members, and I'd ask that you get back to them in a timely fashion. For those that are asked today, if you could get back to us within 15 business days from today, be most appreciative so we can work on fashioning your budget for going into, or the department's budget going into next year. Again, I'd like to thank you for being here today, and with that, and unless there's anything further for any members, this committee is now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
We look forward to giving you